Thank you very much. Good job. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be here today to address you on a subject near to my heart. Now, I'm hoping I don't disappoint you because I'm not a historian. I'm actually an engineer. See, all on earth is an engineer standing in front of you. But what will unfold is I have a very unique perspective on this subject, as you will find out. The thing with engineers is we're nuts and bolts kind of people. We like things that work, systems that make sense, outcomes that can be measured. And I think when I look at the whole subject of Nelson, I tend to dwell on the nuts and bolts, not the emotional side. And Nelson fascinates me. Obviously, he was an incredible hero, but it's his strategic mind. He was a real winner. He just used to win every battle in a time when we were always rubbing shoulders with the Spanish, with the French, or whatever. And he took a lot of great care in training his captains to a level that they understood the intent and they could work autonomously to achieve that. Then you also notice Emma Hamilton. She fascinates me because she was brilliant in an age where women's brilliance was denied. And you will learn more about that. And then Merton, which is just up the road, not far from here. That fascinates me because that was the only house he chose for himself. He spent most of his life at sea. And that was the house that he actually wanted, where he tried to establish roots. Otherwise, he was fairly itinerant and moved wherever the Navy pushed him. And then, this is really not so much a history talk. It's a story of love, romance, and war, and should be a very interesting subject. I hope you agree with me. So, the unique perspective that I talked about, that's my family. That's at Exeter University. And going back, that's my mother and my sister. My mother was called Raglan Tribe. And you'll notice something. I've got Horatio in my name, and she had Horatia in her name. Going further back, that's my grandfather, the rather severe-looking gentleman. He was a judge, and my grandmother, and he's got Horatio in his name. You'll see the pattern where they're going. And then my great-grandfather, basically, that's Raglan, Somerset. That's where I got the weird name from. But then also Horatia, Elizabeth Anne, and that she had a whole bunch of siblings. Hugh, who did a huge collection of Nelson stuff and donated it all to Greenwich Maritime Museum. And Philip, who became an Admiral. Then my great-grandfather, he became a vicar. He was the vicar of Radstock, and he had Horatio in his name as well, and he had lots of brothers and sisters. And then Horatia, who was Nelson's only daughter, in fact, a child. And she lived to a ripe old age and married a Reverend, Philip Ward, in Burnham Thorpe, which is where Nelson was born. And then, of course, Horatio Nelson and his mistress, Emma Hamilton. His wife, Fanny, couldn't have children or any more children because she had been married before. And it was quite accidental when they conceived Horatia, and it caused an enormous scandal of the age. It wouldn't be a big deal now, but back then it was a big deal. Now, people tell me, you say to me sometimes when they find out that I have such a famous ancestor, they say, how did you find out? And I say, I was researching my family tree last year and I found that it went back to Nelson. And coincidentally, I've got Horatio in my name. But the reality is my mother did a program of waterboarding and indoctrination from the year dot. If we went to Trafalgar Square and we went round it in a bus, she would get us to wave to our four greats-grandfather. And we went round museum, gallery after gallery, seeing various collections. I found it incredibly boring. And our house was full of stuff, full of letters and portraits and so on that had just been handed down the family. So you're enjoying this subject through a lecture. I had to do it the hard way by being brought up astute in this area. And that's my point about the unique perspective that I have. So this story is going to unfold in 3 acts. So first we're going to cover Nelson, the legend. Then we're going to go through the rise and fall of Emma Hamilton, which is a remarkable story in itself. And then finally, there's aftermath, the legacy, the ray of hope, Horatia Nelson. But first I'm going to take you back 228 years to the Battle of Nile, just to get a feeling for the brilliance of this commander. So back then, Napoleon had landed in Egypt. He was looking to cut off the British from their artery to India, which was an incredibly important trading route for our prosperity and continuing the war effort against France. And what Nelson did was he was hunting the French fleet, and he knew that if he could destroy that fleet, Napoleon would be abandoned in Egypt and would then have to come back the long way round. So that was what he was looking for. But they were very sneaky. They hid their fleet in a bay called Abukir, very close to the land. And he stumbled across it. And of course, back then, warfare was very rigid. You would start at 9 o'clock in the morning and both sides would sail along each other, knocking 10 bells out of each other. But Nelson never followed the rule book. He always did things differently. And he found this between this island and the land, he found the anchored French fleet. It was dusk. He didn't wait for morning. He did it in the night. And they had assumed where they had anchored that they were so close to the land that you couldn't get anything down the other side. And he sailed his British fleet between the French and the land, and in the dark, basically knocked 10 bells out of them. And that explosion was the Orient, and it was a huge explosion. The whole magazine went up. But they destroyed, with this daring attack, the French thought they were safe. With this daring attack, he totally destroyed the French fleet. There was no retreat for Napoleon to come back to France. And it's just an example of how he never followed the rule book when it came to war. So that was the Battle of Nile, and this is 1798. And really just a few years before then, so Emma Hamilton was married to a guy called Sir William Hamilton, who was the ambassador to Naples. And she was his wife, and she was an incredibly attractive woman, and she had been Romney's muse. So all the palaces across Europe, she would have been the pin-up. She had been painted. So she was one of the most famous faces in that age. And he was on the Agamemnon, and he called in, and he struck up a friendship with William and Emma. And he was dazzled by her because she was so pretty. She was much younger than William. She was 26 at the time. And she was fluent in French and Italian and antiquities. She would entertain people in the British Embassy in Naples. And he was absolutely captivated by her. And he basically struck up a friendship with them, and he wrote to them quite often. The thing with Nelson is we know an awful lot about Nelson because he was a massive letter writer. Like Napoleon, we have about 9,000 of his letters. Letters to family, letters to the Admiralty, letters to kings and queens across Europe. Because in this titanic struggle with Napoleon, he was very well connected to the Habsburgs, the Turks. Everybody was looking. He was the last rebel force to keep Napoleon down. So he was a very important character. And at that time, in 1793, Emma Hamilton was much more famous than Nelson because she was the Kate Moss, she was the pin-up. Her face was seen everywhere. Also, because of her role in the embassy and because of her fluency in Italian, she'd become, and French, had become very close friends with Queen Carolina, who was the Queen of southern Italy. Italy hadn't been joined there. And Queen Carolina, her sister was Marie Antoinette, who was guillotined by the French. And so she was very anti-French. She was a Habsburg from Vienna. And so she was very interested in Nelson and what he could do for their cause. And Emma Hamilton was her confidant. Her husband was King Ferdinand of Italy, and his brother was King Charles of Spain. King Charles had aligned himself with Napoleon. King Ferdinand would have probably done the same, except his wife was very anti-French. And so he was, and also that, I don't know how much you know about the Habsburgs, but an incredible Austrian family who married everybody in Europe. And the women tended to do the ruling. When they married a king, they did all the administration, while the king was a sort of playboy or whatever. That was the same in Italy. So Queen Carolina is the source of power there as well. And Emma had built up quite a lot of influence with, which is absolutely key. So much so that when Nelson needed supplies a few years later, you couldn't land in Spain, you couldn't land in all of these ports because they were all allied to the French. And back then, King Ferdinand was reticent to too overtly support the British because his brother had turned French, and also they didn't want to provoke Napoleon. And Emma used her influence with Queen Carolina to basically supply the British fleet of Sicily, which was a big deal, which meant that he could then do the Battle of Nile and fight that campaign. Now, after Nile, I talked to you about the explosion on the Orient. Unfortunately, it also blew open Nelson's forehead. This is a guy who, at Calvi, lost his eye when grit was thrown up into it. The eye was intact, but he lost the vision in his eye. At the Battle of Tenerife, a musket ball shattered his elbow, and he had to have his arm amputated in the years when there's no anesthetic. And he says that his big memory was how cold the steel was, and the surgeons, to do it, because sometimes the trauma would kill the person, they would have to work incredibly fast. And he just remembers being very conscious of the cold steel, and then insisted then on that the surgeon should warm the steel to body deep. But the surgeons could do this in incredibly fast, sawing and cutting. Anyway, that's how his arm went. And then at Nile, his forehead was split on top of that. Every single time, there was no convalescing, there was, but as soon as he was fit, back to active service again. It's quite something. And this painting was by the Italian artist Gazzardi, and it came up for auction a few years ago. You might recognise that's Philip Moles from the Cool Fortunes. And he asked us if we could do a bit of an opening, if you like, at his gallery. I'm sure it probably helped the auction or whatever. So that's my wife. And yeah, we had a nice champagne reception there. And that was painted when, after the Battle of the Nile, Nelson went to be convalescing in Naples. And Emma looked after him. This is by a British artist called Abbott. And again, it just shows you the horror of his injuries. Interestingly, he painted that before the Battle of the Nile, before he would have had that bandage. And what he did was he took the painting out after the Battle of the Nile and he added the bandage underneath, and which is quite interesting. But we see Nelson all strutted up in his uniform and everything, but this was at a very fragile human time when he was very badly injured. And of course, while being convalesced, William astonishingly encouraged his wife to look after her. William was a lot older than Emma Hamilton. He was 61, she was 26 or whatnot. And he encouraged it because everybody wanted to bathe in the glow of Nelson, who was the sort of toast of Europe at the times. And of course, Emma and Nelson fell madly in love, and which I'm sure speeded up his recovery. The word did get out that actually perhaps the relationship had moved a bit beyond purely platonic, and the Admiralty, fearing the worst, summoned Nelson back for duty. And he kept writing back saying, "No, I'm still too sick, I'm still too..." In fairness to him, he did suffer from incredible headaches after that last injury. And of course, when he lost his right arm, he was right-handed, so he had to learn to write with his left arm, which it would have been difficult for such a big letter writer. And of course, he was going to do anything just to stay with Emma Hamilton. And in the end, he realised he was going to have to go back. But he chose to go the long way round. So rather than going straight back into the nearest ship from the port in Naples, he actually went the long way round. So he went up Italy, over to Slovenia, through Slovenia, Vienna, met up with the Habsburgs and so on, and then went all the way around over northern France back to Britain with Emma Hamilton and William. And he was obviously feeling past it or whatever, so he didn't seem to mind it and relished more the attention that they got hanging out with Nelson. So it was a very peculiar thing, but that trip back was a lovesick holiday for Nelson. And a few years ago, I was asked by the British Embassy to open a plaque to Nelson in a hotel in Slovenia, Hotel Elefon. And so I did a speech, but I speculated that it might even have been in this hotel that Horatia was conceived, which of course set the crowd wild. Now, if we just round off the first act with Nelson, a few years later, there was the Battle of Trafalgar. So after the Battle of Napoleon started rebuilding the navy, and his big aim was to stop the pesky British once and for all. He had stationed 112,000 soldiers at Bonn, waiting for the right moment to cross the Channel. And all that stood between Britain and an incredible military commander, his armies, was the Channel and Nelson's fleet. So when Nelson returned, he was trying to get ready for the last massive blow, if you like, with the French. They had reassembled their fleet, but they also had Spanish fleet as well. So I said that King Charles of Spain had thrown his hand in with Napoleon, so they had all the Spanish as well. And then Nelson, again, totally unconventional. He didn't sail alongside them, blowing 10 bells out of each other. He came in tangentially, and not on one line, he did it in two lines. So one of his thrusts, him, and the other was Collingwood. It was a very risky manoeuvre because the cannons can't fire from the front. So during this period, as they're coming in, they're taking all of the fire from the French and the Spanish. But they knew that if they could connect, they could break up the whole formation of the French and Spanish navy, and then it would just be chaos. There's another thing with Nelson. It wasn't just tactics, it was incredible training for all their men. These ships were about the same. In fact, the French and Spanish ships were slightly bigger, they had more guns. But Nelson knew you could fire your guns faster, you basically got more firepower. So they trained their crew, trained so that they could fire their guns 3 times faster than the enemy, which was like having 3 times more cannons on board. And Nelson knew it was going to be madness. He had all his captains in his cabin. He said, they won't be expecting this. And remember, you're at the mercy of the tides and of the wind. So to set this up requires incredible seamanship. And then when he had all his captains in his cabin, he said, look, as soon as first contact, all the plans will go out the window. And if you get confused as to what to do or wherever we talk, you can't do worse than just drawing up alongside an enemy ship and just blasting it out of the water. And that was, he called them his band of brothers, or captains, and highly trained, highly disciplined, and they could just work autonomously. It was a sort of self-organizing system. He set up the battle as he wanted it to, so it would surprise the enemy and then let events unfold. It was so overwhelming, they completely either captured or sunk 2 navies in one go. That was the last time Napoleon had any sea power, which meant that after 1805, he was limited to logistics moving it over land, which was way slower than by sea. And that gave the opportunity for us to win in the Peninsular Wars on land, and then obviously the Battle of Waterloo, because we could just go anywhere we wanted with our sea supremacy and land supplies and equip the army. So it was incredibly important from that point of view. And that was the end of Napoleon's sea ambition. Villeneuve was the Admiral of the French fleet. He was captured. And as Nelson died at that, I'll come on to that a little bit more. But Villeneuve actually attended Nelson's funeral. Returned to France afterwards, because they were very gentlemanly in those days. They would send them back. And then Napoleon, he was so furious with him, had him shot. So he would have done better to stay in prison. But as I said, at about 1:15, as the Victory was coming to the line against the French flagship, the Redoubtable, up in the rigging there was a sharpshooter. Nelson would have really stood out because he was in full uniform. Back then, they wanted to demonstrate to their men that they're there, very present as leaders. And he was shot, and the bullet went into his shoulder, through a whole load of major blood vessels and his lung, and then lodged into the base of his spine. He was carried from the quarterdeck down below, and he gradually bled out over the next few hours. But while he was there, he kept asking for news of the battle, and then desperate pleas to people about, you will look after Emma Hamilton, as he realized he was not going to last. So the man that delivered the end of Napoleon, it came at a huge cost to him. But after the Battle of Trafalgar, we had sea power for the next 100 years, which was a massive element of Victorian prosperity. As the Industrial Revolution held, we could send our goods all over the world, totally safe, because of the Royal Navy. And that wasn't challenged until World War I. So, in fact, if you go down to Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, you can go round Victory, but there's also the Warrior there, which was an incredible ship as well. It was so sophisticated, it was so high-tech, it hardly ever saw action, because every time anybody saw it, they would just run away. So the British absolutely nailed sea power. So that was Nelson. Then in the second act, we've got Emma Hamilton's rise and fall. She came from an incredibly poor background. She was born to an illiterate blacksmith. Up in the north, in Flintshire, in a little village called Ness. Her mother, Mary, was basically living there with her grandmother was there. And before Emma was even born, her father had died. He was a blacksmith, worked in the local colliery. And so that was her start. At about the age of 12, she had started working, as they did back then. She had no formal education, but she worked for a doctor in the village, a Dr. Thomas, and she looked after his children. And somehow, I don't know how, she taught herself how to read and write. She was very bright. Anyway, she looked after these children. I think there were a number of jobs that she did, but the problem with Dr. Thomas was his youngest child died, and then they didn't need Emma anymore. And she, with her mother, moved to London to try and make something and to get out of Flintshire. She met a guy called Charles Greville, And she was very beautiful, so she would turn heads. And Charles Greville was an MP. And he didn't have very much money. He was on a £50 a year allowance. It was a difficult time to make money. You either had an allowance or you were working dawn till dusk in fields or whatever. So he knew Romney, the artist, and various other artists, and he would earn a bit of extra money by getting Emma to pose. And so here is one of Romney's paintings, and you can see from that she was indeed very beautiful. And she was fun. So he would take her to parties. She would meet other aristocrats. Her strategy in life was to try and get one of them to fall in love with her. They'd get married, and then that would raise her to the next level. But I can't remember what his title is, but Featherstone, who ran a park, he became very attracted to her. He wanted her as a mistress. But the thing is, she would ride horses with him. She would go hunting with them. She would do everything that the boys did. And she was very beautiful. And she was also intelligent. And she made them laugh. So she grew on that sort of high society. And this was how probably the only way back then she could gradually move upwards. Now, Charles Greville, he had an uncle, Sir William Hamilton, who was the ambassador in Naples. And Sir William's wife had died and never had any children. And Charles Greville was hoping to get his inheritance. And he was getting very worried that what happens if my uncle marries somebody else and has children? That's my nest egg gone, basically. So he had the idea of basically sending Emma to become his mistress to Naples. A bit of a problem because Emma loved Charles Greville at this stage. And he could settle some gambling debts and prevent his uncle from remarrying and having children. And his uncle was about 61 now. One little matter though, Charles never told Emma this was the plan. He said, what a nice idea if I send you to my uncle to have a holiday in Naples. And she went with her mother. Her mother was still in tow. And Sir William sensed that she didn't know the plan. And he was very respectful of her. He didn't force himself on her. And again, he was infatuated with Emma like everybody else became. And Charles then wrote another letter after she'd been sort of 6 months in Naples saying, by the way, you're not coming back. You're to become my uncle's mistress. So it was a very cruel time. She was absolutely beautiful. And William was actually very consoled. He was very gentle with her. And he taught her French and Italian. And he also taught her about antiquities. You'd do volcanology, go up Mount Vesuvius, all of those kinds of things. And she became, in her 20s, and she was like a sponge. So that was a picture of Charles Greville. And she became, that's William Hamilton, she became his Pygmalion project. And actually, with time, although he was much older than her, she did start falling in love with him. And the idea was very much she was just to be his mistress, because low-born people weren't allowed to marry aristocrats, obviously. That was how things were back then. But in the way she played the relationship, she basically insisted that he marry her. And this was a massive breakthrough for Emma Hamilton. So from being a mistress, she suddenly became Lady Hamilton. She was the ambassador's wife. And everybody passing through Naples wanted to see the model who was on all the portraits everywhere. And she could speak to them in French and Italian, and she knew about all these subjects because he's educated her, and she was very good company. And then she gradually got to know Queen Carolina and so on. An incredible story, and everybody would make a note. If you're going around Europe, do call in at the embassy. There's a party every single night, and you might meet Emma Hamilton, and she'll be absolutely dazzling, as indeed she was. And she might even do performance. She used to do things called attitudes. She would dress up in Greek god time, and it was apparently mesmerizing or whatever. However, Charles Greville was furious with his uncle because this had scuppered the plan. He didn't think there's anywhere on earth she would be married to him, and that William would not do that because she was so lowball. And so he started getting very worried in case they started having children, and then that would put scupper his inheritance. So that was one problem. The other thing is, Sir William's boss, the foreign secretary, was a guy called William Grenville, not to be confused with Charles Greville. But William Greville, who was head of the Foreign Office, was also furious with William. How dare you marry this woman? I told you, I forbade you from doing that, because he did ask it. He's what you would do. And he got very difficult with his insubordinate worker. And little things started happening. There was a time when there was a rebellion in Naples, and the king and queen had to be evacuated to Sicily. And Nelson's fleet was nearby, so he was asked to try and evacuate them. And it turns out William Hamilton funded the evacuation out of his own pocket. And then, when he went to his boss, William Grenville, and said, "Can the British government now remunerate me?" his boss refused. And that evacuation cost £8,000, which was a huge sum of money back there. This just kept haunting him. So sometime later, when he retired and he was expecting, his pension was delayed for years. So the guy was very mean and pernicious. And William paid a very heavy price for it. It beggars belief today, but this is how things were back home. Now, I talked about the relationship with Queen Maria Carolina, and she really valued Emma because Europe was just going up in flames with revolution, and she used Emma quite extensively as a sounding board. It was very difficult for an aristocrat to know how to behave, how to handle rebellions and things. And because Emma was so grounded, she would give very good counsel as to how to play things so that you don't end up getting your head chopped off or whatever, or what happened in France. So she effectively was the de facto ruler of Italy, and Emma was her confidant, and she hated the French. So all useful things. Now, during that time, King Ferdinand would write often to his brother Charles, and Emma would intercept the messages or feed them back through the embassy and tell the British government. So it was very useful intelligence gathering. She was right there in the court, able to, with her finger on the pulse. On another occasion, Napoleon blockaded Malta, and she was a very kind person. She was very much for the people. And out of her own purse, she funded several shipments of grain to feed the Maltese. which they were very grateful of. And the Tsar of Russia was so impressed by this act that he awarded her the Maltese Cross, and she became then a dame in her own right. So the picture I'm trying to present, she wasn't just a model, she was actually a really good operator in a time that was very difficult. And then a little time after this, Nelson showed up with his head blown open for convalescence, and sometime in that Naples period, they conceived their child, Horatia. And she wasn't, then they came back through Vienna. Horatia was then born back in Britain in 1801. And Emma never returned to Naples. She had spent 20 years there. She had carved out a very good position. I'm guessing she kept a Lancastrian accent all her life, but I'm guessing that to the Europeans it wouldn't have sounded too common because they wouldn't have been so natural in English dialects, sort of thing. So it was, she could live this aristocratic life without the stigma of being lowborn. When Horatia was born, Nelson was anchored off Torbay, because now, again, they were trying to keep the French penned into France and stop them from crossing. But he was delighted that he had a little daughter. He absolutely adored her. And he then bought for Emma Merton, just up the road. And now, I actually used AI to generate this. I took an grade and it turned this into a nice colour picture and put Horatia, Emma and Nelson on there. It's quite cool. But that was from a slightly different angle. This is the River Wandle with a little ornamental bridge. And it was a very beautiful house, but it was a serious wreck. So Nelson bought the house with 52 acres. It cost £9,000. Now, he had made himself quite wealthy because of all the prize money. Every time they could capture a ship, then they would get remunerated by the Admiralty if they could bring it back in a way that they could then turn it around and use it back. So a lot of the British ships were originally French ships or Spanish ships or whatever. And he loved, this was his only house. This was his roots that he had actually created. And in letters, he refers to it as Dear, Dear Merton. And this, he had this idea that he was going to start retiring there, living a normal life with his wife, if he were ever allowed to marry her. William had died. He died in 1803. And so this was his happy retirement idea once they could finish the French off, basically. And then promptly, after 52 acres, he went and bought another, for another 115 acres he added to that. So this is Merton Way. This is the extent of the estates that he had bought. It was huge. It's Wimbledon now, or southern Wimbledon. I went and took a picture of the Wandle there. It looks much nicer there. But when he paid for Merton, he put down £3,000 and he borrowed the rest from a friend of his, Alexander Davison. Funnily enough, there were other people in the Navy, his captains, who made themselves far wealthier than Nelson, because if you were too senior, you weren't leading the boarding parties. So you didn't get as much prize money. But after Trafalgar, when you added it all up, he had actually become quite wealthy, but he didn't have the cash available at the time to settle things. Anyway, He paid an extra £8,000. There was another 115 acres. The house needed masses of renovation. The surveyor, came back with a very bad survey report. It was built on clay, that was shrinking. There was all kinds of problems with it. But he ignored the surveyor because Emma liked it. So it went ahead anyway, and then they started piling in tons of money into Merton. There's another, that is the engraving I referred to, and that is supposed to be Emma. So it's quite interesting because they added these large bays. She fitted it out with loads and loads of portraits of Nelson, sea battles, everything else like that. And so we're now up to just prior to Trafalgar with this incredibly ruinously expensive project that they'd both taken on. Nelson complained to the Prime Minister that he basically was paying £1,800 a year to Fanny, his ex-wife. And he said, after everything, I'm only left with £800 a year. And he complained to William Pitt, who was a good friend, who was the British Prime Minister. So it was in his will, because back then you didn't really leave your money to women. You left it to men who you trusted, and you hoped that they would take care of their obligations. So Merton wasn't left to Emma, but she had the right to live there until she died. That she had the use of the estate. He also left in his wills £4,000 for Horatia's education, which Emma honoured, basically. And I said to you, Sir William, she should have got £800 a year from Sir William, but various problems, you had Charles Greville, who also felt that should go to him. So the upshot was she was in a very precarious position financially with where Nelson had left her when he died. And on the morning of the Battle of Trafalgar, he was acutely aware that Lord Grenville, William Grenville, had not honoured William's debts, that Merton was incredibly expensive, and he was relying very much on his older brothers who were going to get all of his wealth, then look after Emma. No. But he clearly was worried about what might happen. He trusted William Pitt, the Prime Minister. So on the morning of Trafalgar, he added an additional codicil to his will. And he basically said, I think I've provided for her, but if it doesn't work out for any reason, I appeal to relation to look after my daughter and Emma Hamilton. Unfortunately, he died, and the money never came. So and we know that now. There was a lady called Sylvia Robinson who wrote a book in defence of Emma. And her bank account was with Coutts, the bank, which is amazingly still going. And she wrote to them saying, can I have her bank statements, please? And they wrote back and said, we're a bank, we divulge that information. You'll have to get permission from somebody in the family. And then Coutts suggested, write to Anna Tribe, my mother, and if she gives you permission, we'll give you the bank statements. So Sylvia Robinson did that. And that was the letter from Coutts basically saying, talk to my mother. And my mum said, of course, yes, you can, you've got permission. And no money ever came into her bank account. So we've got this situation where on paper she should have been okay. She only had the use of the house. and she was given all the debts, and all the money went to Nelson's older brother, William. And there was this element going on because society didn't approve of Emma's union with Nelson. And as you propel Nelson up to become this god, it was like, we're going to bring Emma down. Anything that could cast a blemish on that, she's the fall guy, so that's completely cut off. So William, and there's a little bit of evidence for this, William, his older brother, and incidentally, his daughter Charlotte had been living at Merton with Emma for 3 years. So they were very close. She was close with all of the sisters and brothers of Nelson. And they found Fanny, his first wife, very cold, whereas Emma was great fun, basically, and warm. So they all liked her immensely. But for some reason, William inherited a massive fortune, all the prize money, from Nelson. And he didn't provide for Emma. He was quite happy to leave all the debts with Emma. And he was given a pension by the British government. He was made Lord Nelson, William Nelson. He was given a pension for eternity, for all of his, and William Pitt died in January of 1806, just soon after Nelson. He was the friend, and Lord William Grenville became the Prime Minister. Enemies in high places. And I think, I haven't found the evidence, but I think that Lord Grenville leant on William and so cast Emma aside, and we'll give you this today's money. That pension is for eternity. The British government will pay, I think it was £4,000 a year, index linked. Incredible. She was supposed to be left some money from Nelson's estate, which he was given on Sicily, but that never came because it was quite bureaucratic, the process, and they'd had quite a few bad years. She never got the money for William Hamilton. Anyway, she went to Dessa's prison with her daughter. And then just come out, and then she had to go again because William, just before he died, William Hamilton, had bought a carriage and that hadn't been paid for. She had to go back to Britain. It was an incredible, and of course she's grieving. So, a sea captain, I don't know, Hardy or somebody, gave Emma his uniform that when he was killed, and she slept with this uniform, this bloody uniform, for a year. It's in Greenwich Maritime Museum now. You can see the hole in and the blood on there. And so she was really grieving, and she was being hounded. She had a small daughter. The house was taken away from her. That's why there's no estate there, because it was parcelled up and kept getting sold, and it's now southern Wimbledon. So she had a really tough time. And yes, she did turn to drink, and she probably wasn't much of a mother. And she just got into debt. She was going to go back to debtor's prison in 1812 for a third time, and she escaped and went to Calais. And died in 1815, basically in the gutter. She had dysentery with her 12-year-old daughter, Horatia. Terrible lot in life. And yet she died in 1850. In 1850, Merton Place was demolished, so it was obviously the renovations never were completed. And just a very sad story for somebody who just dragged them out of the gutter at the start. Terribly tough life that hung around with royalty around Europe and then back And she wrote in letters she would do anything to be able to go back to Naples, which was the place where she'd been happiest. So, for that, how are we doing for time? You all okay? Yeah. Good. Excellent. Horatia, you would be my great-grandmother. And this act is about her. To begin with, when she was born, they were very coy about whether it was theirs or not. They pretended it was somebody else. So they'd just arrived back from Vienna, and they were in Britain. But clearly, after a couple of years, Nelson dropped any pretext of the fact that she perhaps wasn't their daughter. So this is a letter that he wrote to her, again on the morning of Trafalgar. And it's very touching. My dearest angel, I was made happy by the pleasure of receiving your letter of September the 19th, and I rejoice to hear that you are so very good a girl, and love my Lady Hamilton, who most dearly loves you. Give her a kiss from me. He acknowledges that he was the father, but they're not saying that Emma was the mother. Interesting. The combined fleets of the enemy are now reported to be coming out of Cadiz, and therefore I answer your letter, my dearest Horatia, to mark to you that you are ever uppermost in my thoughts. I shall be sure of your prayers for my safety, conquest, and speedy return to dear Merton, and our dearest good Lady Hamilton. Be a good girl, mind what Miss Connor says to you. That was their nanny. Receive, my dearest Horatia, the affectionate parental blessing of your father, Nelson and Granta. He was dead a few hours later, with this enormous mess that he left Emma. So what happened to Horatia? In 1850, when she was nursing her mother, who was dying in Calais, and she died, the British then suddenly woke up, because Napoleon was back on the rise again, that she would make a very good trophy. So they hurriedly sent Sir Henry Cadogan over to Calais to spirit her away. And he went over there and he brought young Horatia back to Britain. And she was then raised from 12 by Nelson's sisters, first Kitty and then Susanna. They would share it between them. And she had a very happy upbringing. She never did acknowledge that Emma was her mother. Anyway, tough start, 2 stints in debtor's prison, nursing her sick, dying mother in Calais. And if she hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here standing in Rome. So something good out of that union. Now, when Nelson died, this was a family that was left behind. They had no money, so they were dependent on Nelson's siblings, or Horatia was. And I got a big suitcase full of letters from the family. And it's interesting. So Horatia was clearly ashamed of her mother, who she didn't acknowledge was her mother. So there is a letter that I've got. It's actually from Horatia's daughter-in-law. And it basically says, just had a letter from the Hamilton family saying, and a parcel with Emma's green court dress from Naples. And they received, and we've still got that dress. But in the letter, she then goes on and says, I don't know why they think we'd want that woman's dress. So happy to have Nelson as the father, but not Emma. Emma was the scandal that was part of the decoupling with Nelson to propel Nelson. She had 10 children. So she married a Reverend Philip Ward in Norfolk and had a very happy life. She lived to the ripe old age of 81. Her oldest son, Horace, short for Horatio, he married Elizabeth Blandy, who was the daughter of John Blandy, who started the Madeira Wine Company. John Blandy was in the army, and he was garrisoned on Madeira to try and prevent Napoleon from landing there. And he developed a taste for Madeira. And he then returned to Britain, and once he left the army, he returned back to Madeira and started the wine company. Made themselves phenomenally wealthy, and Elizabeth was his daughter. And she married Horace, who became the vicar of Radstock. But there's a story there. So in another of these letters from him, he talks about because sea captains would go and pay their respect to Horatia. And he was against the Navy. Of course he did. Like his grandfather. And he sensed that his mother was a little bit off that, so he went and wrote to the Admiralty wanting a commission. And it came back, this letter from the Admiralty, say yes, we'll talk to these docks or whatever. And Horatia, his mother, said, what's that? And he showed it to her. She chucked it in the fire and promptly collapsed in a heap after all of the trauma of what she'd gone through. So interesting, said he never did go into the Navy, and instead he became a vicar like his father, Philip Ward. And then one of their sons, my great uncle Phil, as he was known, he became an admiral. He saw active service in Egypt and the Boxer Revolution. He was on the Royal Yacht, and he became very good friends with King George V and Queen Mary. He died in 1937, and luckily he had a wife called Dorothy, and she died a few years later. She was in Bath, and her house was bombed, and she was killed with her sister Rachel. So luckily he didn't see that. So that was Philip. And then the other brother, Hugh, he became the vicar. He went to Oxford University, became the rector of Wickham. And then when he retired, he moved to 32 Marlborough Buildings in Bath. And he was the one that assembled all of the memorabilia and created this huge collection. One of the things he had is Nelson's death mask. And after his younger brother Philip died, and he became good friends, who was in Badminton House during World War II. And she had a habit, she would come round and ask to look at his collection. And she just had a habit of saying, oh, I like that. She'd hold it like, anyway, it went messy. We didn't see it, but funnily enough, there's one just like it in Windsor Castle. But the rest of the collection, in all its glory, went to Greenwich. And then my grandfather, Raglan, he went to Cambridge and he became a judge. He studied law. Interestingly, one of his pals, a guy called Raglan Tribe, he died in World War One, and his son, Raglan, introduced him to my mother, and they got married. So there's this sort of continuity. But during the war, he served in the intelligence service because he was so good at languages. So he'd obviously picked that up from Emma. He was very fluent in German and French, so very valuable, clever guy. And he started, because he used to listen to all of Hitler's speeches, he started writing about it. He said, this guy is really, everybody was very sympathetic to Germany. The French had been very pernicious against them after World War I. And he said, yeah, don't get mulled into that. This guy is pure evil, and he was translate Hitler's speeches and write them and disseminate this information. So much so, he actually got put into Hitler's black book of the people to round up should they conquer. Luckily, though, he had the last laugh because he was one of the judges at Nuremberg. He wasn't a sentencing judge, he was just an observer of justice. There we all are. Not bad for some penniless bastards from old Nelson. Nobody ever had much money, basically, but all seem to be quite bright. I'm sure that must be something to do with Nelson, although that obviously got increasingly diluted by the time it got to me. So the scandal that finished Emma was also a blessing to me. So that's it. Are there any questions? Good.